Welcome to Minds Between Languages. We have with us today Daniel Gile, who was a professor for translation and interpreting studies in Paris. He is talking with us about effort and cognitive pressure in interpreting and how practicing interpreters have contributed and still contribute to the field of interpreting studies. Welcome to Minds Between Languages, Daniel. It's really great to have you here.
Thank you for inviting me.
It's wonderful. Shall we jump right in?
Yes, let's hop, skip, and jump.
You developed one of the maybe most cited frameworks in interpreting studies, the effort models. Now, to start, maybe could you explain what you mean by effort and maybe also outline the basic tenets of the effort models?
Okay, when I was a student of conference interpreting at ESIT in the 1970s, that is the past century, the teachers claimed very forcefully that if we fully mastered our working languages and if we had enough extra linguistic knowledge, then speech comprehension and speech production during interpreting were spontaneous and effortless. In the context of the effort models, what I mean by effort, in a very intuitive way, is that neither speech production nor speech comprehension are spontaneous and effortless. They entail some analysis and some decision-making, which rely on non-automatic mechanisms, and they are often consciously felt as effortful, not always. This is something that psychologists knew, but it was ignored at ESIT. So one basic tenet of the effort models is that exploring interpreting as an effortful, in that sense, set of operations and their interactions can explain many intriguing phenomena and unsettling phenomena that could be observed in the classroom and in the field. Each effort, so-called effort in the effort models, is a functional set of operations that should be easy to identify intuitively by students and by professionals as performing some distinct function, like listening to a speech and analyzing it, like producing speech, like taking notes, reading notes, like storing information in memory for a short while and retrieving it from memory, like directing one's attention to listening, to speaking, to note-taking, and so on.
Right. Now, you speak of effort, but there is another notion that we can hear quite often in cognitive interpreting studies, which is cognitive load. And this seems quite similar, doesn't it? Do you see differences between those two terms? What would be the differences? What would be the similarities?
Okay, here we move from the intuitive notion of effort that is directly perceived by people and that can be measured somehow to something that is more like a construct in cognitive psychology. So the manipulation of symbols is a bit different. If you're aware of the effortful nature of certain operations, then a few questions arise, like what is it that makes them effortful and how to measure the effort involved? So one way would be to ask people how effortful they feel a task is, and then try to correlate this perception with the number of working hours or with how many kilograms of goods they have to lift to perform the task, and so on and so forth. So you could look at cognitive load as representing, in a way, how much effort is required to perform a task at a certain level of performance, and effort would represent how much muscular or other investment you actually produce when performing the task. So the effort may be sufficient to meet the demands of the task, and it may not be. If we're talking about a machine that needs to lift goods, then the relationship between the two is rather simple, and both the load and the required effort can be calculated using simple Newtonian physics. But if we're talking about mental operations involving strategic and technical and tactical communication behavior through language, the picture becomes very complex with much variability. And we do not know whether the effort required to understand the same speech segment or to verbalize the same idea at a particular performance level is the same from person to person. It may differ quite considerably. but it could also vary from time to time in the same person depending on circumstances. So one rough indication could be given by the amount of information that needs to be stored in memory if we're talking about cognitive psychology in what is referred to as working memory before it can be reformulated, but it's very rough. And we do not know that everyone will have to devote the same effort to keep the information in memory and then reformulate it in the target language. It depends on the structure of the information, on how it relates to other knowledge that the person has in long-term memory, to skills, etc., etc. Neither do we have very accurate and reliable ways to measure the effort. We only have indirect indicators. One of them is pupil dilation, which only works below certain levels of effort. And we have other physiological indicators that are not sufficiently reliable, accurate, and convenient at this stage. Of course, we could use performance indicators with limited accuracy, but we do not know how well they relate to cognitive load or to actual effort. They tell us something, perhaps something useful, for instance, by demonstrating the positive effect of preparation for conferences or the negative effect of fatigue, of stress, or distractors. But I think we should be humble in our ambitions to have precise quantitative data for modeling and operational purposes for the time being. Perhaps neurophysiological exploration technology and data will take us further.
Because these are very complex relationships we are looking at. Effort on one hand, load on the other hand, and then measures, and we don't really know what they're telling us.
I think that the basic relation between cognitive load and cognitive effort can be summarized as follows. One represents how much effort would be required to perform the task, and the other, how much effort is actually spent on the task. In terms of exploratory potential, I think it's a strategic error to use the two concepts interchangeably, and several investigators have fallen into this trap. Another important point is that the amount of effort that will be invested in a task is not necessarily a reliable indicator of the cognitive load, because it also depends on motivation, especially in the context of interpreting. Sometimes you just give up or don't go into a lot of trouble. At other times, if you're more motivated, you will devote more effort to the same task. I think we should beware of simplistic assumptions about relations between constructs and indicators.
Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you developed the effort models? And maybe also what was your motivation?
Yes, well, there were two motivations. This was before I gave a lot of thought to all these contracts with which I became familiar with reading the cognitive psychology literature. There were two motivations. First, trying to understand the difficulties that plagued us students and that plague professionals regularly. And secondly, to try to help students understand. So I started out with observation and introspection, with a first version of a model for simultaneous interpreting, with three functional efforts: speech comprehension, speech production, and short-term storage and retrieval, what I call the memory effort. But while I was exploring the cognitive psychology literature, I found that the models would benefit from another distinct functional entity, namely the coordination effort, which was in charge of distributing attentional resources among the three core efforts. And then I developed models for consecutive, for sight translation, for simultaneous with text in the same spirit. I gradually explored the compatibility of the models with explanations of problem triggers that were often mentioned in the literature, as well as strategies and tactics, and made the tightrope hypothesis explicit, and developed a model for simultaneous into sign language, and developed other hypotheses, and incorporated the so-called gravitational model of language availability into the effort model paradigm. The gravitational model looks at availability as the time and effort required to identify language units heard in a source speech, that's in comprehension, and as the time and effort required to select and assemble language units when producing speech, that is in production. As we speak, the effort models are being updated further with more efforts on the basis of exchanges with colleagues and on the basis of the literature. What I should like people to understand is that the effort models are holistic ways of thinking about cognitive constraints and their effects on interpreting. They are not descriptive cognitive architectures to be tested and refined for an ever increasing granularity of the description. It's a sketch, not a map, and aims at usefulness, not at maximum accuracy.
Now, one of the core assumptions that you also just mentioned is the tightrope hypothesis. Now, what does it mean exactly? And are there ways to test this assumption empirically?
Okay, what the tightrope hypothesis means is that overall, as the cognitive demands of all the efforts engaged at any time combine, interpreters work close enough, I don't say how close, but close enough to the maximum cognitive resources they either have or are willing to invest in the task so that they often fail to achieve the level of performance they seek to achieve. They're close to falling, as it were. They're close to failing, be it in terms of informational accuracy, in terms of language output quality, or otherwise. In other words, that many errors in terms of meaning, language, non-voluntary omissions, and infelicities are due not to insufficient knowledge, but to their inability to enlist the required cognitive resources to complete their task successfully, either because they cannot or because they don't have enough motivation to push through because of the effortfulness of the task. As to testing the hypothesis, I think it's being verified every day in the field and occasionally in empirical studies. Let me start with the latter with just a couple of examples. If we believe that many what I call EOIs, errors, omissions, and infelicities, are caused by high cognitive pressure that interpreters are unable to overcome through their cognitive effort, then one could hypothesize that by reducing the pressure, one would also reduce the number of EOIs. So this was done by Rafael Barranco Droege in his doctoral dissertation defended in Granada, Spain in 2015. He identified what he called hotspots in authentic interpretations of an Obama speech, that is, places where there are many EOIs in the interpretations. He designed an experiment in which he either lengthened pauses in the recording of the speech in those hotspot segments he had identified to set up an experimental condition, or left the speech as it was in the control condition. He then asked interpreters to interpret the speech in either the experimental condition or in the control condition and compared errors and omissions. As expected, he found that there were less errors and omissions in the experimental condition with lengthened pauses, which corroborates the tightrope hypothesis. So it's not a final proof, of course not, but as things go with theories that are being tested, it corroborates it. If we believe that interpreters tend to work close to cognitive saturation, when they do a repeat performance interpreting a speech, they can be expected to make less errors and omissions the second time around, right? Because some of the comprehension tasks and some of the reformulation tasks have already been done the first time. So this is indeed what happened in an experiment I conducted in 1999. But another finding was that the second time around, errors and omissions were made by interpreters who interpreted the same segments correctly the first time. Now, how is that possible if they were able to understand and reformulate them correctly the first time? The tightrope hypothesis offers the only plausible explanation that has been offered so far. At least this is how I see it. I'm waiting for another plausible explanation. Now, what about the effect of the presence on screen of number and proper names produced by automatic speech recognition when interpreting? Interpreters miss less. Why would they miss them the first time, if not because they reach cognitive saturation? And of course, from very early on, interpreters and researchers alike have recognized that interpreting errors and infelicities were often due to cognitive pressure. I prefer to use pressure rather than cognitive load and cognitive effort in this case. The cognitive pressure associated with time constraints, multitasking, poor input signal quality, etc. All of this says the same thing as the tightrope hypothesis. Just as the numerous lists and studies of problem triggers which increase cognitive pressure. So actually, the tightrope hypothesis can be viewed as close to trivial. This may be the reason why it took me so long to decide to make it explicit when presenting the effort model's conceptual framework. Is there a point in testing it? I have my doubts, at least as long as no other serious candidate is offered to explain the regular EOIs found in the performance of qualified interpreters. As I said, my effort models are a sketch, not a map, and trying to test them as if they were a map with claims of accuracy makes little sense, especially when using an indicator known to be totally unreliable at high cognitive pressure levels. As we say in French, le mieux est l'ennemi du bien. Sometimes you get a better idea of an object by using a magnifying glass than by using a microscope. But if using a microscope makes you feel superior, well, please be my guest. What I think would be much more useful is an exploration of actual cognitive mechanisms involved in the effects of the tightrope hypothesis. How exactly does cognitive pressure lead to EOIs? And under what specific conditions? How does this vary with experience, with preparation, with specific tactics and strategies? In what language pairs and in what direction? How much variability is there around this phenomenon? This, I think, would be a very productive avenue for exploration. And I think this is something that you are in your group that you're exploring when looking at English as a lingua franca in interpreting. Something, yes, I guess that would be about my answer to your question about this very important point.
Yes, and I'm sure you made your point, but it's an important one. Now, you just mentioned the strategies and tactiques that it would be interesting also to look at how these influence cognitive pressure. What would you expect, for instance? What is the role of interpreting strategies or tactiques in dealing with cognitive pressure?
Well, there are several pretty obvious roles. If you have more preparation, then you have more knowledge, and maybe your knowledge in long-term memory is better structured, so you're expected to be able to retrieve it more easily, to activate semantic networks for representation of your knowledge. Certain tactics also reduce cognitive pressure, but certain tactics may reduce cognitive pressure and have a cost in terms of previous segments or later segments because they're associated with time lag. It's all pretty basic logic. And the basic logic is almost trivial, I would say, nothing to boast about. The question is, can we measure the effects? And can we measure variability?
That's where the difficulty lies. Now, you mentioned something else that is very particular about interpreting, which is the time lag. The speaker might already have started a new sentence, and me as the interpreter, I'm still in the previous sentence. What does this time lag mean in terms of effort?
Okay, I would say that what happens, and it does happen very often, there's an accumulation of information in working memory when this happens. Information from the previous sentence or from the previous speech segment, and information from the unfolding sentence. So there should be higher cognitive pressure and more effort should be required to complete the task. This is what I refer to as imported cognitive load. You cannot measure imported cognitive load measuring the effective cognitive effort only, because the effort may be sufficient or not sufficient depending on motivation, depending on all sorts of things. But there should be more pressure. This is again basic logic. What happens exactly is worthy of investigation. Is there a threshold of information beyond which errors, failures are likely to occur? This is suggested by the findings of one recent doctoral dissertation completed in China in 2020 by Shao. It is reviewed in Serial Bulletin number 60. Now, what are the parameters that determine the outcome of such a situation, including the nature of the information, local tactical behavior, language-specific features, and so on? All of this is quite interesting to explore. One point is that the lag may be the result of high cognitive load upstream, but it is also a generator of further cognitive load since it induces further pressure on working memory. So it's quite a complex cascade mechanism.
Yeah, I see. Now, I would like to talk a little bit about you too, because I've recently learned that you were actually trained as a mathematician and you also have some training in elementary physics. How has this training influenced your work?
Yes, I was trained as a mathematician and I worked as a mathematician for a short while, but I was never a brilliant mathematician. Still, I think the training has left a lasting imprint on the way I think. Somehow my brain seems to have suffered from that. Mathematics makes use of conceptual structures, largely based on creative imagination, which people don't realize, and it makes much use of logic. And logic is very constraining. From the mathematics, I remember either you have proved a theorem or you haven't. And before you consider you have a full proof, every step in the rationale must be foolproof. As long as it is not, you may speculate, but you cannot claim. It's either one or zero. Either you have the proof or you don't. And I think this may be the reason why I'm very sensitive to flaws in the rationale presented in interpreting studies research, be it in the design of studies, including sampling procedures, or in the inferences made on the basis of data. I mentioned indicators earlier, referring to cognitive pressure, cognitive load, cognitive effort. If we're not sure about the relationship between the cognitive pressure and cognitive effort, to what extent can we draw conclusions on cognitive load on the basis of cognitive effort only? And to what extent can we even rely on various cognitive effort indicators to inform us about cognitive effort? This is well known in experimental research. There can be floor effects, ceiling effects, many confounds, etc. I'm not saying that this uncertainty makes findings useless, far from that, but they're still uncertain, especially if the sampling is not representative in the statistical sense of the word, because of the choice of a sampling frame, which is inadequate, or because of the sampling procedure. And because of that, in many cases, I prefer descriptive statistics, where everything is laid out in the open and you can make up your own mind as to possible conclusions, rather than using inferential statistics. Some colleagues seem to attribute magical powers to the significant versus non-significant dichotomy, but I prefer an explicit rationale with data being presented so that I can look at variability, at possible outliers, and see what I do with them, and so that I can look at other data of interest. Of course, there are many other cases where inferential statistics necessarily on samples are much more powerful. But again, as regards interpreting, I consider that drawing conclusions on individual behavior based on a sample without looking closely at inter-individual variability is not in line with the caution that is supposed to characterize science.
Yeah, that's pretty much clear. Now, there is something that you also brought into light, and that might be also very particular about interpreting studies. And this is that many researchers are also practicing interpreters. What have practice searchers brought, or what can they bring to the field? And what, in your perspective, can we as researchers give back to the practicing community?
Very good question. I think that the interpreting studies discipline is the product of the will of practice searchers, starting with Seleskovich in the West, the so-called West, and Chernov in the USSR. Seleskovich in particular explicitly called for research on interpreting by interpreters. So the situation is different in translation studies where academics took the initiative and have been very active since then. But as regards interpreting studies, it is quite clear to me from bibliographical data that if interpreting studies has developed and prospered, it is thanks to the interest of practice searchers, not thanks to the interest of academics from cognitive disciplines. Moreover, I think we need practice searchers to keep the focus on interpreting as opposed to bilingual phenomena, bilingualism, cognitive control, linguistic comparisons, which seem to be the main interest of researchers from cognitive disciplines. Their knowledge, their methodology, and their work are valuable as input, and I'm more than happy to acknowledge that and express my gratitude to them personally for their input. But we interpreters and translators, including trainers of translators and interpreters, are interested in translation and interpreting as such. In interpreting studies, practice searchers have contributed insights into the strategic and tactical behavior of translators and interpreters, and have thus corrected misperceptions by comparative linguists and by psycholinguists. They've also contributed conceptual frameworks that I believe are useful for training purposes, regardless of their scientific value. I'm thinking in particular of interpretive theory, of scopus theory. They also keep the discipline alive by fulfilling academic requirements, associated with teaching positions in interpreter training programs, and they keep raising relevant questions. I'm referring in particular to sign language interpreting research, a branch of interpreting studies which I like very much because it is more down to earth and usefulness oriented than research into spoken language conference interpreting. The interaction with professional researchers from cognitive disciplines is very valuable as well. There's no doubt about that. But it is the practice researchers who have had the leading role in the discipline, for better or for worse, depending on the period. Now, what can we as researchers still contribute to the practicing community? We need to be careful when answering a question. One thing we should avoid, in my opinion, is making big claims about providing the ultimate solutions to problems, to fundamental questions. There's too much variability. There are too few of us. There is still too little research expertise amongst us. There are not enough participants for replications. There is far too much complexity in the interaction between tasks, skills, knowledge, efforts, expectations, motivation, personality factors, etc. I would say that in a way, this is similar to research into economics. You may have identified general trends that link supply and demand, business practices, financial practices, demographic trends, climatic change, international relations, and what have you. But there is so much complexity in interactions that no scientific formula can claim to determine the best way for a government to run a country's economy. I heard so much from experts at an OECD meeting who were exchanging among themselves. Does this mean our research is useless? Certainly not. We can offer some insights, perhaps help practitioners realize that received wisdom is not necessarily very wise, and offer them the opportunity to explore other possibilities. I'm referring to questions such as quality perception, directionality, training practices, and perhaps professional practices as well, including note-taking and the use of emerging technological tools. All of this through data, not necessarily with sophisticated research methods.
Right. And despite all the complexity that we encounter as researchers, we are still doing research on this very complex topic. So, from your personal point of view, why do you find it interesting to study interpreting from a cognitive perspective?
Well, thank you for asking me to answer from my personal point of view. I would not be capable of answering objectively, only subjectively. What has fascinated me from the start is how difficult it is to meet the high goals we conference interpreters endeavor to attain in terms of information accuracy and language output quality. So this is what led me to a cognitive exploration of interpreting. It may not be the most important aspect of interpreting, and looking at spoken language community interpreting and at sign language interpreting, I would say that other aspects of interpreting are far more important to society. But personally, I find the cognitive angle much more stimulating intellectually.
So I think we can all feel with that. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for your time. Thank you for participating.
Well, thank you very much for your patience and your questions.
Thank you.